During the ancient period, for our purposes, the Copper and Bronze Ages, Neolithic societies all over the world had developed an intimate relationship with their physical surroundings. Sedentary societies learned how to adapt to their environments, and over time, they would also be able to plan for long-term survival. Irrigation allowed them to store fresh water for drier seasons, and dams were built to divert rivers. To understand any culture or civilization, it is most important to study their environments and the framework in which they grew, a rule that still applies to modern society. Check out our previous documentary, where we went over this same topic for the preceding Paleolithic and Neolithic. Though humans had occupied most of the world by 4000 BCE, the first civilizations to emerge were Mesopotamia and Egypt. The Indus Valley Civilization was next. Although all three were based in somewhat harsh climates, their rivers and fertile soil led them to develop major civilizations independently. The first we'll touch on is Egypt and the Nile. Shortly after Egyptian unification, during the First and Second Dynasties, Egyptians began working the land to create bigger spaces for crops. The Nile allowed them to not only irrigate their farmland, but provided fresh drinking water. The Nile begins from Lake Victoria, in Kenya, its life-giving waters flowing thousands of miles north through Egypt, and into the Mediterranean Sea. Because of erosion, should the Nile ever dry up, it would leave longer and wider gaps than the Grand Canyon in the United States. Each winter, the Nile would flood the valley, leaving fertile silt and mud once it receded. Though the most important, the Nile wasn't Egypt's only major river. Bahr Yusuf branches off, flowing into a then freshwater lake, today called Birkit Karun. Around this lake is the Fayum, or Fayum Oasis. Before the Nile flows into the Mediterranean, it separates into numerous branches, creating the fertile Nile Delta. During the Paleolithic, Egypt had more abundant rainfall, and its inhospitable deserts were lush grasslands, able to sustain rhinoceros, elephants, and even giraffes. North African hunter-gatherers could use this meat to support their small societies. About 200 years before Egyptian unification though, around 3300 BCE, Egypt became drier, and the slew of wild animals either migrated or died, leaving the soon-to-be Egyptians to rely on agriculture. By the time of the pharaohs, with less rainfall in this drier Egypt, farmers had to use irrigation. This specific irrigation came to be known as basin irrigation farming. Those crops which needed more water, like vegetables, were kept closer to the river and watered often with the shadoof. The shadoof was a highly efficient irrigation tool, with evidence of its first use in Mesopotamia around 3000 BCE, but Egyptians were using it by 2000 BCE as well, and continue using it today. Because of its ingenious lever and fulcrum design, a single person was able to operate it efficiently. Grains were placed further back, and only needed the initial flood water to grow. Date trees were planted even further back, on higher ground, as they had longer roots, and needed the least water. Larger basins would be built by the pharaohs, some as large as 50,000 acres in area, and would serve as a source of water if there was a drought, or the annual floods were low. Farming settlements were built close by, but up on natural hills to avoid being flooded. The Fayum Oasis was an agricultural center early on, but during Egypt's first intermediate period, the Bahr Yusuf became blocked off by silt, until the Middle Kingdom. Amenemhat I, first pharaoh of the 12th dynasty, removed the silt, and widened the Hawara Channel to increase water flow to the Birkit Karun. This turned the Fayum into a large irrigation basin itself, and also able to hold water in case of drought, or flood escape if the Nile became too high. Senusret II and Amenemhat III, also of the 12th dynasty, had their pyramids built here, signifying the location's importance at this time. The height of flooding varied each year, and both high and low floods were bad for crops. To measure the water level during the inundation, Egyptians used a structure called a nilometer. If waters were high, signals could be sent so others could prepare. Year after year, the Egyptians would be able to estimate where the rivers would flood most and could even estimate their harvest. Just to the east of Egypt was Mesopotamia. It was surrounded by mountains to the far north and east, the Persian Gulf to the south, and harsh deserts in the west. But at the heart of Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, were the Tigris and Euphrates, providing water for agriculture, and facilitating trade and communication. In the north was what became known as the vast plains of Assyria. In the south was the alluvial region, and what became known as Babylonia. Babylonia itself was divided into the northern river plain, known as Akkad, and a delta to the south, home to the Sumerians. To the east were marshes, and beyond that, a region that would be in constant contact with Mesopotamia. In Babylonia, agriculture was based on irrigation, as rainfall was more scarce, and the annual river floods were unpredictable and less helpful. Furthermore, the Tigris was a fast-flowing river, making it difficult to irrigate, so farming settlements tended to be centered around the slower-flowing Euphrates, which fed the majority of the alluvial plain. In the spring months, snow melts from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey, causing the Tigris and Euphrates to flood. Because the flooding is severe, and often occurred during times of harvest, drainage systems and flood control was of utmost importance, not just irrigation. This often led to conflict. Irrigation and dam building upstream could often negatively affect the water supply for those further downstream. This was usually unintentional, but was done intentionally as well. After the fall of the Neo-Sumerian Empire, during the period dominated by the Amorite city-states of Isin and Larsa, Abissare and Sumuel of Larsa built dams to divert the water from the rival city of Isin. Though his plan succeeded, the diversion also affected Larsa, which suffered from famine. A revolt or invasion soon ousted Sumuel, and Nur-Adad became ruler. He and the next ruler, his son Sin-Edinum, restored the water's original course. Further out from the fertile areas were muddy desert regions. During the long summer months, you can find foxes and jackals here, on the hunt for smaller animals. During the ancient period, this landscape was full of grasses, and attracted animals like gazelle and onager, an animal similar to a donkey. Of course, where there are herbivores, hyenas and lions also roamed. There were numerous watering holes for animals to gather around, like geese, pelicans, and ibises. Human settlements were generally found along the waterways and smaller branches of the major rivers, but small villages would often become abandoned if their water sources changed direction or dried up. This was the environmental theme for much of Babylonia, or South Mesopotamia, and though not always united, the city-states all shared similar experiences through their connection to their rivers. City-states could thrive in these resourceful river valleys. To their west was the harsh desert, and to the east, the marshes that separated Mesopotamia from Elam. In the foothills of the Zagros Mountains, there were woodlands and grasslands. Part of the Zagros, the smaller mountain range of Jebel Hamrin, served as a frontier between the northern plains of Assyria and the southern plains. The Diyala River flows through these mountains and into the Tigris in the southwest. South of this river are the aforementioned marshes that separate Babylonia from Susiana. They inhabited the same plains as the region of Babylonia, but were culturally much different, not needing the Tigris and Euphrates to prosper. Rainfall alone was sufficient for agriculture, though they did have plenty of smaller rivers to use for irrigation. Pastoralism was quite popular. In the winter, sheep and goats grazed on the plains, eating jujube and tamarisk. In the summer, they relied on the fresh pastures of the Zagros, a region filled with oak and pistachio trees, and home to wild red deer, and untamed goats and sheep. Susiana, along with this Zagros region, was called Elam by the Mesopotamians. To Elam's east would be the Iranian plateau. They would develop closer economic ties with the groups who lived there than with Mesopotamia. Though the marshes blocked the way, there were still routes from the north and south that could give Elam access to Babylonia. The northern route also connected with the more hostile Assyria. Elam's northern boundary was the Diyala River and the Zagros Mountains just a bit further. Apart from providing rich summer pastures for pastoralists, there were three distinct valleys, the Ronia, Roandus, and Sharazu, where people were able to settle. Because of the difficulty in reaching these remote locations, they were usually inhabited by more tribal mountain folk than by large civilizations. It is from these mountains that Assyria and Babylonia would come under attack from the Guti tribes, Hurrians, and Kassites. One of the most important and unifying geographical regions of the ancient world was the Mediterranean Sea. It shaped culture all along the coasts of southern Europe and North Africa, along with Anatolia and the Levant. The Mediterranean itself was born out of the breakup of Pangaea, from a gap between what would become Europe and Africa, called the Tethys Ocean. It didn't have direct access to the vast Atlantic at first, but soon the tectonic plates shifted enough to form the Straits of Gibraltar, letting in the salt water. The Mediterranean is also known for its volcanoes and mountains. These are all a result of tectonic plate activity. The Alps, Apennines, and Caucasus are all a result of collisions between the African and European plates. The same force that created these mountains gave them a rich diversity of elements. There are various deposits of zinc, lead, copper, and oil all around the Mediterranean basin and the surrounding mountains. During the Bronze Age, copper was mixed with tin to create bronze, the most important metal of this period. Though the Mediterranean was a commonality for those that lived around it, climate varied wildly between each region. Lower areas, like Venice, would be susceptible to flooding from heavy rains, and in the western Mediterranean, anticyclones led to high winds and unpredictable temperatures. During the winter months, the north coast of Africa could even experience snow, while in southern Europe, the summer heat can be enough to cause major health concerns for humans. Despite this, these same regions were perfect to farm olives, grapes for wine, and figs. The first major civilization to emerge from the Mediterranean were the Minoans. They inhabited the island of Crete and were a seafaring culture that dominated the Aegean. The Minoans began to decline around 1550 BCE, perhaps due to an eruption, earthquake, or invasions from the mainland. During the next period, the Greeks and Phoenicians would inherit the title of masters of the Mediterranean. The trading lines and colonization routes of the Greeks and Phoenicians would later be followed by the Hellenistic culture, the Romans, Byzantines, and Muslims, once Islam came to prominence. The diffusion of languages, religions, and architecture is quite apparent all around the Mediterranean basin. The ancient Indian environment was spread out over three geographical areas of the subcontinent. Peninsular India is the region that sticks out into the ocean and looks roughly like a triangle. The extrapeninsular mountain region is a system of mountains that acts as a division between India and the rest of Asia. Lastly, are the alluvial plains of the Indus and Ganges. During the beginnings of the ancient period, by around 3300 BCE, the Indus Plains were inhabited by the Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan, after one of their largest cities, but near the end of the ancient period, it was the Ganges Plain that became more populated. The Indus Valley Civilization, successors of the traditions of Neolithic Megar, occupied a very large area. Water flow originated in the Himalayas from melted snow, which flowed from tributaries to the Indus, occasionally flooding and depositing fresh silt to the plains, before draining out into the Arabian Sea to the south. While previously thought that settlements only rested near the Indus, the majority of settlements were built along another path. But why would this be? During the Bronze Age, there seems to have been another, even more important river, that ran parallel to the Indus, called the Gagahakra. Vedic literature, like the Rig Veda, tells of a river called the Saraswati, personified as a deity, which possibly could be the Gagahakra River. It didn't see the melted snow from the Himalayas, but relied more on rain from the monsoons. Once monsoons shifted during the Bronze Age, the river went dry. The Indus civilization was able to thrive within its natural geographical boundaries. To the north, the Himalayas kept them separated from the affairs of East Asia. To their east was the Thar Desert, a region too inhospitable for settlements. To the south was the Arabian Sea, where they most likely organized trading routes to the northwest. To their west was the region of Balochistan, today parts of Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. It was mountainous, but there is evidence of routes, like the Khyber Pass, which allowed the Indus contact with those to the west. Climate in the ancient period was most likely similar to today, and the Indus Valley Civilization must have relied on the river floods, instead of rainfall, as monsoons only affected certain regions. It's possible droughts would begin to occur more frequently, as time went on. Just over the Himalayas was China. From the Tibetan Plateau in the west, China is 16,000 feet, almost 5,000 meters, above sea level, and decreases as you head east. The western 70% of the region is over 3,200 feet over sea level. China's major rivers form in the west, and follow this downward route to empty into the sea in the east. Over many years, these rivers have created canyons and chasms. The greatest of these was the Yellow River, the mother of Chinese civilization. The river itself is over 5,400 kilometers, or 3,300 miles long, but the silt would deposit where the river flooded in the east. Though civilization in China would emerge here, the unpredictable flooding would cause problems for future rulers. It has overflowed, broken dikes, and caused many deaths just over the ancient period alone. This would give the river the nickname of China's Sorrow. China's other major river, situated to the south, was the Yangtze, or Changjiang. This river was longer, at 6,900 kilometers, or 3,900 miles long, and while it was less prone to flood, it also has caused major damage in Chinese history. Its extensive tributaries created a marshy wetland in the south of China, leading to rice cultivation and trade by the river, while the north relied on grains. The vastness of China made it home to various different climates. Rainfall was dramatically different from north to south, or east to west, and most regions weren't integrated into a unified Chinese culture for centuries. China's mountains also factored into both its culture and history. Culturally, the 5 sacred mountains denoted the 5 cardinal points: north, south, west, east, and center. Other mountain ranges served as protective barriers from barbarians, and served to influence many pivotal moments in Chinese history. China's coastline kept it safe for millennia, and it barely even needed defending, until the British came with opium in the 1700s. China itself rarely set out on any naval adventures, and apart from state-sponsored voyages that reached Africa during the Ming, China had no interest in exploring much past their coastline. China's story during the ancient period, and well beyond, will always be linked with its geography, be it the major rivers, mountains, or plains. If indeed we head off the Chinese coastline, we find Japan. The island was still home to a Neolithic society called the Jomon, which emerged in 14,000 BCE, and lasted over 10,000 years, until around 350 BCE. We had mentioned their earlier phases, the incipient and initial, in our prehistoric documentaries. The Jomon weren't identical to each other, but did practice similar traditions. By the early and middle phases, they were still hunter-gatherers, but would settle into a more sedentary lifestyle for longer periods of time. The word Jomon means cord-marked, or corded rope, devices they would use to decorate their pottery. The decorations lead us to believe that the Jomon had a somewhat complex society, as artisans were needed to create this art. They would also use precious stones like jade or obsidian, and people were willing to pay high prices for these crafts. The Jomon burial customs also show that they had some kind of cultural beliefs about the afterlife. Female statues and figurines were also found, and could indicate a fertility goddess of some sort. The indications of religious practices could point to a priest class, but there is still no hard evidence for this. To the north, the later Ainu, perhaps descendants of the Jomon on Hokkaido, did have shamans to perform religious ceremonies. The geography of the region gave the Jomon a varied diet. Meat from animals was available, fish along the coastlines, and fruit and nuts from the mainland. They could even have created wines. Their trade was local, between small communities, and they used salt to help preserve their food. Houses averaged maybe 12 meters in floor space and were just small pits with a shabby roof. They had larger buildings as well, although these were for the entire community. There is still much we do not know about the Jomon, but they seem to have a perfect environment to thrive as many smaller bands. The Jomon language itself is still unknown, but could be related to the Japonic, Ainu, or even Paleo-Siberian languages. Europe is small, but a very diverse continent because of its geography. A major difference between Europe and the African and American continents is that Europe is quite small going north to south, but quite long, going west to east. Not including the Mediterranean coastline which we touched on earlier, this creates a fairly even temperature with similar rainfall across the entire continent. The similar environments all throughout Europe also meant similar plant and animal life, and agricultural practices. Forests, being so dense, served as natural barriers as well. Still during the Mesolithic, hunter-gatherers migrated around forests not through them, preferring hunts on the coastlines and the edges of woodlands. Once agriculture spread more, societies still settled away from forests, or flattened them, to make way for sedentary farming life. What made the European regions unique, though, were their mountains and seas. These are what created the boundaries that separated different regions, leading each down different paths. In the very east are the Caucasus Mountains, while other important ranges are the Carpathian, the Pyrenees, and the Alps. As expected, we see barriers, like mountains, separating different cultures, like those north and south of the Carpathian. During the early part of the ancient period, flat grave cemeteries were used to bury the dead south of the mountains, while the north had larger earthen burial mounds. The Alps also limited contact between metal-producing cultures on both sides, while the Pyrenees kept France and Spain separated by land. Bodies of water were a hindrance as well. Not all cultures were able to build ships, so sea travel was difficult or impossible. The English Channel, though small, delayed plant and animal species from entering England for over 1,000 years, even though these species had already been domesticated all over Western and Central Europe. In the Americas, archaeologists find common threads among the distinct cultures in Central America that aren't found in either Northern or South America. They've termed this region Mesoamerica, a territory that covers present-day Mexico, Guatemala, Nicaragua, Honduras, El Salvador, and Costa Rica. Despite being a relatively small region, Mesoamerica has quite a diverse climate and geography. Some areas can suffer from extreme dryness, some from extreme heat. In other areas, the highest mountains can drop into the lowest of lowlands. The higher lands were divided into two regions. The Sierra Madres is a range of mountains that are located in the north, while the highlands of Guatemala and Chiapas lie south of that. Both are elevated areas, making them drier. The highest lands were called Tierra Fria, meaning cold land. These were frigid regions, especially at night, and were dry and arid. Here, irrigation systems needed to be used for agriculture. Tierra Templada, or temperate land, was at a lower elevation. These regions were a bit warmer and wetter, and were perfect for maize agriculture. Further south was the lowlands, Tierra Caliente, the hot land. The lowlands began as a thin strip in the north, but widened as you traveled south. They were much wetter, especially in the summer, and associated with tropical forests. In South America, Tierra Helada, or Tierra Nevada, refers to the highest and coldest land, the highest points of the Andes Mountains. Mesoamerica was prone to earthquakes and possessed numerous active volcanoes. Though dangerous, the volcanoes created fertile soil and gave Mesoamericans access to obsidian, molten magma that is turned into natural glass and could be used to create sharper tools. In the center of Mesoamerica was the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, the shortest distance between the Gulf of Mexico and the Pacific. This is where Mesoamerica's two main habitats converged, with the mountains to the west and rainforests to the east. And it was here that the first major civilization of North America would emerge. The Olmec.